Hello everybody, I'm Roy McCoy and welcome back to the latest episode of my series, What Happened To, where we take a game and or series from history that has somehow disappeared and we ask the questions, what was it like, what happened to it, should you play it if you get the chance, and will we ever see another one? In this episode, we look at one of my favourite survival horror games ever made, Dead Space. For those of you who have never ever seen one of these games, think Resident Evil in space, heavily influenced by a great film called Event Horizon. If you haven't seen that film, check it out because it's bloody brilliant. Before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe. I make one of these historical videos every Tuesday. But on that note, it is time to start our journey through time and space. Back to 2008, when the PlayStation 3 reigned supreme. This game was developed by EA Redwood Shores, who later became known as Visceral Games. You are looking at one of the most terrifying and beautiful survival horror third-person games I've ever played. The game takes place on a mining ship that has discovered an artifact known as the Marker. You take control in third person of Isaac Clarke as he tries to navigate his way through these zombie alien creatures known as the necromorphs. Think an evil hybrid between the aliens from Alien and the kind of gene stealers from the Warhammer 40k world. You also have to deal with his psychosis and navigate your way through the mining ship, solving puzzles and basically surviving and not trying to jump out your living skin. This game was amazing. The basic plot is you crash land on the Ishimura, which is the name of the ship, and you're searching for your girlfriend, Nicole. You see a bunch of messages throughout the game, but spoiler alert, it turns out she didn't make it. She committed suicide before becoming one of the necromorphs. I told you spoiler alert, so if that's ruined it, I'm really sorry. The whole big arcing enemy is something called the Hive Mind. A little bit like the Queen from Aliens, and they control the necromorphs. One thing I need to say at this point is the world and the environment, the graphics were phenomenal, the lighting was terrifying, the whole environment, the whole world building was brilliant by this game. It truly is a horror classic, a survival horror classic. The gunplay was spot off, being able to basically use a laser to carve bits of the necromorphs off. It was phenomenal fun and a great game, and it still holds up. You also, along the way, encounter a number of obstacles and kind of puzzles, including kind of physics-based puzzles. There's zero-G environments, there's vacuum environments where you've got to find oxygen. You also gain powers like kinesis, all while not trying to absolutely panic when the necromorphs come out of vents and corpses, and oh, this game is so good. If you haven't played it, play it. Go back and play it. And try and avoid my spoiler. Oops. You also meet a variety of interesting characters along the way. And it all kind of ends up with a big boss fight, your girlfriend's dead, and you escape out into the darkness of space. I love this game, and I look back on this game with fond memories and also a little bit of panic remembering those necromorphs. And the critics agree with me. As of making this video, the meta score is 88 for the PS3 version, and the user score is 8.8. And as the old maxim goes, this is not a maxim, it's basically what I say, when a company makes a good game and the good game is profitable, they make a sequel. Now, for this moment, I will only be focusing on the main series, but I am going to talk about the spin-offs a little bit later on, because this is a series that created a world. In 2011, we were greeted by Dead Space 2. Once again, you take control of Isaac Clarke in a game set 3 years after the original game. Basically, you awake on a ship with no memory of what happened previously in the middle of a necromorph outbreak. Roll-on powers like kinesis, oxygen vacuums where you run out of oxygen, and also dismemberment of necromorphs. Yes, this game was also brilliant. You visit a variety of new locations and old locations, and the story is once again just as compelling. Isaac teams up with a girl called Ellie as they make their way trying to basically destroy the Marker. The big bad guy in this is a guy called Tideman, who decides he wants to reverse engineer some information in Isaac's head to create more markers and therefore bring the end of humanity on. There's also a lot of plot twists and double crossing. This game really is an improvement, in my opinion, on the first one. Think Alien for the first one, think Aliens for the second one. You also get to see the Ishimura once more, and Nicole, your girlfriend, your dead girlfriend, is back in the form of a manipulative being that is a representation of the marker that tries to control Isaac. Yes, this game is trippy and it's brilliant. The graphics, the lighting, the music, and the gameplay is phenomenal. And that's not to mention how great the actual story is. I cannot recommend Dead Space 1 or Dead Space 2 highly enough. Another thing that made Dead Space 2 really good and really interesting was the fact it had a multiplayer. And it wasn't only me that loved it. As of making this video, the PS3 version scores 89 as a Metascore and a user score of 8.5. This was loved and also did really, really well, which you know what that means. If one's good, two's good, they make a sequel. And number 3 was created by Visceral Games once more. Coming in February 2013, this was the last entry, and it was a little bit disappointing. Not third time lucky, sadly. Now, before I get started, don't get me wrong, it wasn't a bad game. It just wasn't a great game. It didn't hold up when you compare it to the original 2 games. Once more, you take control of Isaac Clarke, possibly the most unlucky man in the world when facing necromorphs. He's even more unlucky. Oh no, Ripley had a few outings as well. One thing that was a bit weird about this one is for the first time it had a co-op system, an online co-op system, a drop-in, drop-out online co-op system. Some people loved it, others weren't quite sure why it was in there. Dead Space, for the whole, was a single-player, terrifying experience, so to be able to have another player with you didn't necessarily work. Think Resident Evil 5, maybe. Once more, and as you can see from the trailer, the graphics were good, the lighting was good, and the story was interesting. You saw Isaac again from the previous game, Ellie, the girl that helped him through the previous game. They had become a couple, and then split up before the events of this game. There was like lots of backstory. Isaac discovers that Ellie's in a new relationship. There's like drama. One thing about Dead Space 3, it did seem to bring the series to a natural end. The ending kind of implies that Isaac dies, that the marker has been destroyed and blah blah blah. However, downloadable content ruined that for us because Isaac's still doing well, and then deliberately allowed us to believe that he might be dead because then they don't confirm his status, so they kind of left it on a cliffhanger, and then there was no more Dead Space. Where once there was Dead Space, there was Dead Space, because the problem was the game didn't sell very well. And the critic score didn't come back that great either. Not bad, but not great. At the moment of making this video, Metascore is 76 and the user score is 6.4. That's a low for the series. Now, what happened to it? Well, before we get into the spin-offs and the extras, I'm going to talk about this. I mentioned that Visceral Games used to be called EA Redwood Shores, which means that Visceral Games was a subsidiary of EA. Seeing as the game didn't sell very well, Dead Space was effectively canned at this point. This was not a good time for Dead Space to fail. EA had just got the rights to LucasArts games, which meant they were about to pump out Star Wars games, and indeed they put Visceral Games onto 2 projects. The first was called something like Jamaica, which was a pirate game set in the Caribbean, which was canned because Ubisoft, however you pronounce that, was also working on Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. The second game they were put on was something called Project Ragtag, which was effectively a Star Wars game that never happened. Sadly, Visceral Games was shut down. Now, before I get into whether or not we could see another one of these games or even a remake, I need to tell you about the spin-offs. First of all, we had Dead Space Extraction. Dead Space Extraction was received really, really well, and it was actually not like the original games. It was a rail shooter, and it functioned as a prequel to Dead Space. It followed the colonists who fought the necromorphs and probably became the necromorphs. You were able to get this game as a standalone kind of PlayStation Network purchase, or also it came with the limited edition of Dead Space 2. And it was worth a play. Most critics gave it between a 7 and an 8, with some going as high as 8.5. The point I have to ask, because it was released on the Wii and the PlayStation 3, Did Dead Space really need a first-person rail shooter? Probably not, but it was pretty good. The second spin-off came in the form of Dead Space Ignition, and this was a kind of puzzle game. It was absolutely trash. It had action, it had puzzles, and it had a comic book style, and it's really not worth talking about after this point. Terrible, avoid it, don't play it. If you play that and think this is Dead Space, you will never trust me again. Just avoid it like the plague. But it exists, and therefore I'm giving it a mention. Most people loathed the comic book style cutscenes. I mean, this was a world that prided itself on kind of realistic, terrifying graphics. And then you got a comic book. But Dead Space also did create a world of comic books. Like I say, it created a world outside of video games. But did we need a comic book style game along with the franchise? No. And the last other entry into the Dead Space world is a Dead Space app, which is set between the first and second game, and it was playable on your iPhones or your iPads or your Androids, and interestingly enough, featured a similar form of gameplay, that survival third-person horror that was seen in the Dead Space series. Now, I said it was because sadly this game is no longer available. If you manage to find a copy of this game, let me know. But sadly, as of now, you cannot find it anywhere, and I have searched. This game was well received by critics, so if you do find it, hit me up because I will be downloading it. Now, back to the end of Dead Space 3. I've mentioned that poor sales and poor kind of reception killed this franchise and that Visceral Games is no more, but could we see another Dead Space 4 or even a Dead Space remake? Well, I hope so. I'm actually relatively hopeful on this one, and I'll clarify this. If EA sees the value and thinks that money can be made by a new Dead Space game, it will be made. So the more you shout, the more you scream for Dead Space 4 or a Dead Space remake, which actually I think I'd kind of prefer. Dead Space 3 was a low point in the series for me, so I'd kind of like them to go back to the start and remake it, or even just change the whole world, get rid of Isaac Clarke. I know that's a sin, but maybe a new character in a new world fighting the necromorphs. Remake or reboot. With the resurgence of survival horror games, with the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and also with games like The Last of Us Part 2, EA will hopefully see the value in resurrecting this amazing series of games. Sadly, I don't think it will be Visceral Games that will be making this, it will be a new team, but I am hopeful. Even though it has been 7 years, I think that people still clamour and clamour. They want this game. So please, EA, reform the team and make this game once more. I would love to see a Dead Space 4 or a Dead Space reboot. Let me know in the comments below what you would like to see. Is it a reboot, a remake, or a number 4? But on that note, this is one of my favourite series, and when I say my favourite series, it's a little bit like the Terminator games. I love the first two, and the rest are just, okay. But on that note, this is Roy McCoy, out!